All right, so the question I want to answer is this: can banks create money? But it's actually, it turns out that yes, banks can create money, but actually, it's not just the Federal Reserve that can create money. And if you research this, you'll come across something called the money multiplier effect. And this is something that actually doesn't matter, but a lot of people will talk about it on the internet. Sure, the money multiplier effect describes creating money, but doesn't really explain why that bank can create any amount of money, like whether they have a deposit or not. How are they just creating money without actually having the money? So the real question is, can banks create money? What about if you're not a bank? Can you still create money? What's going on here? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and say the quick answer is if you have a group of individuals that believe in the value of the tokens, let's say dollars. It could be any currency, but let's say we're talking about dollars. If they believe that it has a value and they believe that you have a certain quantity of it and they believe your records are accurate when you transfer it, then the money essentially does exist. It's like, it's not just about it's not just that if you believe that you have money and that the money, the individual tokens, that you have value. It's not just that you have to believe it. That would be nice if you could just believe it and it would be real. But all the members that are doing transactions have to believe it. But if they all believe, then it essentially becomes real because the transactions can happen. Sounds really weird, but that's how it is. And you might say, well, if that were true, wouldn't there just be like large numbers of people just trading like imaginary dollars that they created fictitiously, but they all just kind of believe that they're real? Okay. That is actually called the Eurodollar system in Europe. Exactly what it is, because it's not even US sanctioned. It's just like imaginary dollars that everybody believes are real. Now, within the United States, you might say, well, what about, is that happening in the United States too? It's more regulated in the United States, but yes, that happens in the United States too. In fact, most of the money in the United States is like that. It's created by commercial banks. Most money is created by commercial banks. So how does a commercial bank create money? Again, it's really simple. If you're a bank and you keep records, at the point where you write down that somebody has access to a certain amount of money in their account, you just write it down, okay? It's not about whether they put the money in, and we're not talking about physical bills here, which physical bills only make up a very small amount of the money supply anyways. We're talking about money that is maintained based on records. Ledger. It's just based on records. Most of the dollars that are in existence are just based on records. When they just write this down, like you have $100 at a bank, you actually then have the $100. It didn't, when you get a loan, it doesn't like come from somewhere else. There's not another account that they pull it out of. It's just not how it works. They write down that you have $100 in their records, and then you actually have $100. You can take that money, and because Walmart or whatever store you're going to, or whatever vendor you're going to, pretty much all of them trust the bank, and they trust that you have a certain amount and that each one of those dollars has value, they will accept that and do the transactions. So that's it. I mean, that's the answer. Brings up a lot of things in your head. I mean, in my head, when I hear that, yes, money can just be created like this, it's like, why is it that banks are allowed to create money, but people are not? That would be called if you were to create the bills, it would be called counterfeiting. And if you just wrote down on a ledger that you had some money, nobody would believe you. But you got to understand that like money is based on trust, right? They're not going to believe you, but they do actually believe the bank, and that's why these banks can create money from nothing. So that's it. I just wanted to explain that because when I look this up, I get a lot of overly complicated and mostly incorrect information about how banks create money. I just wanted to kind of set the record, not necessarily straight, but at least more straight, and simplify things some. Key point being, anybody can just create money. The question is, are all the parties involved going to trust that person? And just to clarify, we're not talking about physical bills, because the physical bills are really just a type of keeping records, right? They're really just a way that makes it, they make it harder to fake, essentially, because you'd have to actually print the bill, and it would have to look like a real bill in order to fake your record keeping. But the way that it keeps records is just the number that you have in possession, or the number of these tokens that you have. So some of the dollars in the system, I think it's less than 10% of the dollars in our system are actually physical, but the vast majority of them are not. They're just kept on record. So if you're thinking, well, if I just write down that I have $100 somewhere, and then I would have to have the actual bills to prove it, whatnot. No, you don't. I mean, that's just not how the system works. You could never, the way our system is currently, I mean, you could never find all the bills that correspond to all the legitimate dollars in circulation in the U.S. because they're just created by records. There's people writing stuff down, like, it's banks that are regulated and stuff, but it's people writing stuff down. It's not actual bills. Then you might think, well, wouldn't this give the banks like special powers? This means that they can essentially create money out of nothing, so they can, and money is used to influence other people to do things that you want them to do. Well, wouldn't this give them like a lot of power to influence people because they can just create the money out of nothing? And the answer is, yeah, it actually does. As I understand it, there are rules and regulations that make it somewhat difficult for the banks to just go completely nuts and just print or create like trillions of dollars just because they want to, sort of. But it seems like the Federal Reserve doesn't seem to be regulated that much in terms of its ability to just create a bunch of money on the spot. But most of the commercial banks, as far as I know, if you just walked into the bank and they felt generous and they wrote, "This person has $1 trillion by your name," they just wouldn't be allowed to do that under U.S. regulations. That brings us to another point, okay? When the banks create money, I'm using this super simple description of, well, they just wrote that you have this much in your account. Okay. Really, they always do it as a loan for whatever reason. I researched this some, and I was trying to figure out like sort of like the difference or the examples of like when they just write a loan, or they write down that somebody has a loan, or if they just write down that somebody has a bunch of money. The examples of where people are just sort of creating the money without creating the loan. I believe during the Revolutionary War, the government just created money in the form of bills. And again, we've already said that's equivalent to the records or ledger system. It's just maintained in the form of bills instead of on a ledger. But I mean, in that case, they literally just like created a bunch of money, and it caused inflation, and bills lost their value. To my knowledge, banks can't just straight up do that where they just write the down that you have a bunch of money. They have to do it in the form of a loan. Okay. So they have to record that. Okay, now you have whatever $1 million, but you also have to pay it back. There's a time period. There's interest. All that. And if you're saying, well, if banks can just create money, couldn't they just like create money for themselves? Like if something went wrong with the banks, couldn't they just create their own money and solve the problem? Apparently that's happened before, specifically with Credit Suisse. They but listen to how they had to do it. Rather than just writing, okay, I have an account and now it has $1 trillion in it, or whatever, I don't know what the number was, but rather than just writing that, they had to basically create a loan. And that's what they did. They created a huge loan, loaned it to somebody who was actually very credit worthy, but they had to deal with them, so he used the money to buy shares from them, and in that way, they actually created the money necessary to bail themselves out. So, that's it. Yes, banks can create money. Yes, actually, other entities can create money too, but the other parties have to trust them. And for the most part, when it's done legally in the United States, it looks like it's typically done through loan creation. Simply because creating it without creating the loan, as far as I can tell, it's not allowed. But if somebody could correct me on that, I would like to know like what law or rule or whatever actually stops people from just creating it without even creating the loan. That's it. Thanks.